Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Stephen. I'm a traditionally published fantasy author. Today I'm doing a video about points of view. I'm going to talk about third person point of view and first person point of view. Let's get some of the basics out of the way first. A lot of stories in the past have not mixed the two together. You have novels that typically stick with first person and it's just, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, it's all first person. You spend a lot of time with one character, you get to know them, and you go through the whole book. With third person, obviously you can have more than one point of view, and you get to see different parts of the world, or the city, or whatever the story's set at the same time, or maybe in different time zones, or different time streams, whatever it might be, but you can do that and you can play around with the form. Until fairly recently, I would say that it was sort of an unspoken rule that you don't mix the two together, but now I have seen this happen in the last probably 10 years. I've seen novels use both third and first person in the same book. Let's start with first person point of view, talk a little bit about that, some of the pros and cons, some of the things that I like about it and some of the things that I don't like about it. This isn't specific to fantasy, this is just my examples will probably be within that space because it's easier to talk with an example than just try and make stuff up. So one of my favourite series ever is the Dresden Files, which is written by Jim Butcher, and all of this is done first person from Harry Dresden's point of view. So it's all, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, but we see it through Harry's eyes as he explores the world. The good thing about this is, over the course of this series, and because it's many books, I've got to know the character of Harry Dresden fairly well. I feel like from inhabiting his skin, from seeing everything from his perspective, I get to understand how he views the world, how he interprets everything. I get to hear all of his inner thoughts, all of his emotions and all of his feelings. And yes, you can do that kind of thing in third person up to a point, but you don't often get as much of the inner dialogue and some of the internal wranglings. And I think it brings you closer to a character when you're in the first person, because you just feel like you're riding along with that person, looking out at the world from behind their eyes, and they have a very unique perspective. And good writers in first person can channel a particular view of the world. So it's not their voice, you're not having the author talk about their religion, their view of gender, politics, whatever it might be, and put that onto the page using their character as a kind of vehicle. The really good authors can write points of view that are completely radically different from their own, but still do it from a very tight perspective and do it in the first person. I haven't done first person myself, apart from a couple of short stories. I tend to write third because of the type of stories that I've done, but it's something I'm thinking about doing in the future with a couple of other series. Another benefit from first person is that you spend a lot of time with a character. And as I said, you get to know them really well. And it begins to feel like that character is a friend and you want to go back to spending more time with them. And yes, you do get that from the third person, but there's something a bit more intimate by having it as a first person. Because it's one person's voice that's consistent throughout the book, if you like spending that time with that character and you like going on a journey, an adventure and whatever it might be, action, romance, you want to go back and do it again. And rereads of books in first person for me happen probably more than third person. Another benefit from first person point of view is that in some ways you can deceive the reader, because the one perspective that you're seeing the entire time is that person's view of the world, but they could also have a bias. And as I said, hopefully it's not the author's bias, but you're creating a particular voice and how this character sees the world, how they interact with everything. The only lens you have is the one that the author has given you from this first person, but they could be deceiving you, the reader, because you only know what they can see. They have a particular hatred for something, or they have a particular dislike for something, or if you start to get into the fantasy book and the fantasy realm, it could be that they view creatures a particular way and say, oh, this particular race is very dirty, or they could just say they're particularly evil. Well, in fact, it's only their perspective that we're given, so we never see the other side. We don't know if they're actually evil or not. So it's kind of a narrow lens, which can be useful when you're trying to hide something from the audience, and it's a lot easier to do when there's only one voice saying, this is how it is, this is how it is, and then suddenly you don't have another perspective from another character coming in and saying, well, that's not true at all. No one ever questions the first person character in the same way. You can have other people come up to the character and have conversation with them, but if you're always being told from this one perspective, this is how it is, it's a lot more difficult to not believe the kind of the vehicle, as it were, that you're inhabiting for the whole of this story. So this also then brings me on to some of the downsides or negative aspects of first person, or just the kind of disadvantages, if you like. So as I mentioned, one of my favourite series is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher, told from the perspective of Harry Dresden. Now the character is a 6'5" guy. Not a spoiler to say, through the course of the story, he's a wizard, because it's a fantasy book in Chicago. And over the course of the series, he gets more powerful and he attracts a lot of enemies. But we only ever see Harry as this guy trying to do good, trying to save people, trying to do the right thing. And it isn't until later on in the series that Jim Butcher has done some short stories from other people's point of view that we get a different perspective on Harry. Now, he's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to help people, and he is quite powerful. And occasionally he'll talk about his own appearance and say, you know, I dress like this, some people react to me like this, and so on, because of my magic and what I can do. But it is when you see the perspective of other people, of how they view him, it becomes really interesting, because they view him as someone who's actually really tall and scary, really quite intimidating, and as his power grows and he becomes more adept at being a wizard, they see him as quite a dangerous threat and become quite worried about him. And yet, from the book's perspective, it's always not sort of sweetness of light and I'm great and everything's great. The situations become more serious and more complicated. But he has this kind of focus of, I've got to help people, I've got to do the right thing. And it's not exactly black and white, but it's perhaps more simple than what the situation actually is, but we never see it from anybody else's point of view. As I said, it's hard to throw that off and think about it and say, well, hang on, Harry's always saying it's like this. It must be true. I believe him. He's the good guy. He's doing the right thing. But you never think, well, is he actually the good guy? Another series that's first person, that's a very different point of view character, are the Jeff Lindsay books about Dexter. And Dexter Morgan is the main character. And it's not a spoiler again to say that he's a serial killer, which, you know, sounds terrifying and awful, and spending time in his skin would be extremely worrying, except that he's quite funny and he's quite witty and he justifies the things that he does, and we hear his internal monologue and we understand his background and his upbringing and all the awful things that have happened to him. So you may not be comfortable with what he does, you can at least accept it from a certain point of view. And so that's two very, very different things, different points of view, both done from the first person, both done from, in theory, a good guy and a bad guy, you could say, but that's very, very simplified point of view again. So there are limits to what you can do with the first person, and it isn't until you get other viewpoints looking at that character from somewhere else to say, is that true? Is that actually how they're perceived by the world? Or is it just the view we're being given by the author on purpose to limit it, to drive the story in a particular way? So there are definitely pros and cons, and it's something you should think about at least a little bit when you're starting to build your story, and think about the perspective. The other limit of first person is you can't go anywhere else. With third person, I can have different characters in different parts of the world at the same time. With the first person, if I want the main character to go somewhere and see something else, we have to go with them. Everything has to fall in line with that first person. Sometimes it can create situations that feel a little bit contrived, that someone, just came and here's the clue that they stumble into, because you can't have someone else go off and then come back. They have to have done that off camera, as it were, off screen, and then come back so that we can see it through the one lens, like this one camera. You don't suddenly have a second camera over here and a third camera over here. It doesn't work that way with first person. So that's another limit in some ways, that you have to get a lot better at telling the stories to make it feel realistic, that it's not just contrived and everything doesn't just happen to the character. It has to feel legitimate, it has to feel real, and it has to feel authentic, which can be a challenge again of the first person. Okay, now let's talk about writing in the third person. This is something that I've done in all of my books. This is where you have multiple points of view, and chapters typically start with one character and stay with that character throughout the whole of it. This isn't always the case, but people have tended to do this. And in some series, particularly in fantasy, they will title the chapter, whatever number it is, but then put the character's name. So you have a very clear indication of whose perspective this is and what's going on. Some of the benefits of writing the third person is that you can go anywhere at any time and you don't need to stay with that particular character as you would in first. If I want to tell the story at the same time on 2 or 3 different sides of the world and all these events are occurring on at the same time, I'm able to do that just by moving to a different character. If you want to do something like a crime novel and you've got perspective of the cop, you could also have perspective of the killer, and then you get this great kind of cat and mouse scenario because you get to see both sides of it. You get to see them trying to outwit each other rather than just one stumbling along trying to work stuff out. You can see it being set up, you can see the payoff, you can see how good each of the characters are at going against each other. Another benefit is obviously with multiple points of view, you can have very different voices. Even though you're writing in the third person, good writers can make them convincing and very, very distinct. A really good fantasy author who does this is Joe Abercrombie. Every one of his characters has a very, very unique voice and you never mix them up, even though most of them are written in the third person. Even the style of how he writes some of the chapters is different. Not just the dialogue of the characters, but the actual structure, the sentence balance, the way the person thinks. Some of the characters in third have an internal monologue. That's one sort of very small aspect that sets them apart. But beyond that, looking at a broader chapter, I could be shown 2 very different chapters by 2 characters and I will be able to tell they were not the same person, even though they're written by the same author. So that's another very clear thing that you can do with third person. Also, you can show, as I said, 2 different sides of a story, but you can show different perspectives. So using one of my own books as an example, Battle Mage, it was all set around a war. And I have one character point of view who's a frontline soldier. So this is someone who has been conscripted, goes and fights the war, but they don't know the high level politics, they don't know everything that's going on, they don't know if the war is going well or not. All they're told is, go here, do this, fight. So you see them at the front of the war, fighting for their lives and struggling every day. And then another point of view is the princess, and she's kind of the higher up. She's dealing with the politics, she's dealing with the kind of treachery, she's dealing with the numbers, the facts and figures. She's not down there on the front line seeing her friends die, but equally she's sort of looking at the battle and how it's going and saying, right, are we winning? What can we do? If we do this, it's going to cost so many hundred lives, but equally that might benefit us in the overall of the war and this kind of thing. So it's very, very distinct and different point of view. And then the third point of view is from a battle mage perspective. And these are wizards who are incredibly powerful. They have overt magic, but because they're so unusual and magic is something that's sort of feared and people worry about it, they don't understand it, they're shunned in some ways. So you have this person that is needed during the war because the other side has battle mages, so you have to have that balance, you have to have them on both sides, otherwise the war would be over in 5 minutes. So they need the battle mages, but equally he can feel everyone's uncomfortableness when he's around them. That they smile and they're happy he's there because they need him, but equally he terrifies these people and he's aware of that. So I have that going through his head all again. And it's a very different and distinct point of view, which is one of the great benefits you can do with third person. Before I go on again, and because I always forget, if you want to support this channel, there are a number of ways you can do it. One of them is joining Headspace, which is a writing community that's run a private Discord that I have, and there's a Patreon link below. Something we're starting in the next couple of months is a book club. Now this is not just we all read a book and that's it. We're viewing books from a writer's perspective to try and help us with our own work. What we like, what we don't like, what we enjoy, and therefore can you take some of those aspects and apply it to your own work? Is the pace too slow? Is it just right? And there again, is that something you can put into your own work as well when you're working on a new draft? So the first book that was picked by everyone on the Discord is this one, The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. We've got a 2-month lead time, plenty of time for people to read it. There will be a thread where people can discuss it, and then we're going to have an online chat and an audio chat and all of us gather together and talk about what we want to do, how we're going to look, things we've learned from the book, things we like, things we didn't like that we don't want to put into our own work. And the online community is there to help people with their covering letters, their synopsis, beta read for each other, and just generally support those who are interested in pursuing writing as a slightly more serious level. So if you're interested in something like that, take a look, there's a link down below. Now let's talk about some of the downsides or complications of writing in third person. As I've said, you can have as many points of view as you want. It allows you to tell the story from multiple perspectives, which is really, really good. The difficulty with that is you have to make all of these different threads work together cohesively. They have to tell a good narrative. Now, it's not that every single character has to interact with every other character in order for it to work, but all of the different threads, all these different bits and pieces have to make a cohesive story. They have to integrate at some level so that when a character is involved in the story, it's somehow connected to the others, and the reader understands this. Now, if you're telling a fantasy story, you can have obviously multiple books, and you can take a bit longer in tying things together to make it satisfying for the reader. But if you were writing a standalone with multiple points of view, then you have to do it a lot more succinctly, you have to do it a lot more carefully, and you have to plan a lot better if you are someone that plans their books. And with multiple points of view, it's probably easier to do that so that the ending is satisfying, so the reader doesn't get to the end and then just go, well, that came out of nowhere. It's one of these things that you want to seed all the way through. This next aspect is both a pro and a con in some ways, that with having multiple voices and multiple characters with different perspectives, there's a chance the reader will like some of them, but not all of them. And I've seen reviews in the past of, not my books, other books, where people have said, oh, I really love this character, I love spending time with them, but then the story goes off into this other character, and I don't care about them, and I just kind of race through those chapters to get back to the story that I like. But of course, that's part of the other character that they don't like, is part of the whole story, and it is important. So if a character, I'm being very simple, but one character is very, very good, and another character is very, very evil, and the reader's like, well, I don't like spending time with the evil character, and they just skip it, they're not getting the whole of the story. And also, you're not going to make every character likable, completely a perfect person that's wonderful all the time, because that'll get boring for the reader. So having variety is good, having different points of view with different viewpoints of the world, of the characters, of the situation is good, but it means that the reader isn't going to like all of them all of the time, which isn't something that you can control. Like if you ask someone about a book with multiple characters and you ask them what's their favourite character, you're going to get a different response from different readers. There's no way to anticipate that, and that's something you just kind of have to live with. I've got books with multiple points of view, and I've had people say, oh, I really didn't like that character, so I just kind of, I read it and I just kind of carried on and didn't really think about it too much, when hopefully you want them to think about the whole book. It's all important on some level because it all has to tie together to make a bigger story. So it's kind of a frustration of the third person, but equally it's a benefit in some ways too, because if it was first person and they didn't like that point of view, there isn't anywhere else to go. They'll probably put the book down and they won't carry on with the rest of the series. At least with third person, there are other options that they can read, other chapters that they can still enjoy. And with having different points of view, it allows the author to experiment a bit more. I mentioned with Joe Abercrombie, he has different styles and different techniques even in the way he constructs the chapters, which is something that you can do again with third person, which I think is a benefit. Another downside is also a pro, it's also a benefit in some ways, is you can have fantastic cliffhangers at the end of a chapter, but then when you go to the next chapter it comes from another character's perspective. That can be both a benefit and a curse, because then the reader starts to get back into that character again and you build it up, and then that one ends on a cliffhanger. So you have this constant kind of rise and fall that drives them forward, that hopefully it makes them read the book faster. It's quite a pacey read because there's this constant cliffhanger after cliffhanger, which is another really strong benefit, I think, of writing in third person with multiple points of view. So I've been talking about this for a while, and I feel like I've still barely scratched the surface of talking about first and in particular third person point of view. I'm probably going to have to come back to this and do a part 2 and maybe a part 3 later on, but hopefully this has given you some ideas, some thought and some indications of perspectives and thinking about which you might want to do in the future and the benefits and the negatives of each one. So that's all I'm going to talk about for today. We'll be back next week with another video.